Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's my first time speaking at Mahfil. I always feel quite honoured when I'm asked to sort of speak about my work and what I do, purely because I don't really see why anyone would be interested in anything I have to say, really. But I'm going to try and make it interesting and as engaging as I can. The topic I was asked to speak about was Syria through my own eyes. But then I had a chat with Miqdad, who invited me here, and we thought it would be more appropriate if I speak more about my work as a whole, as a humanitarian, and sort of how I got into it and what I studied and how I got into this line of work, because it's quite unusual for someone from our community, really. Then I thought I'd go on to sort of speak about the things I've seen and what I've experienced, and I'll of course touch on Syria as well. So as I said, I'm a humanitarian aid worker. I work for an organization called Muslim Aid, which is an international non-governmental organization, humanitarian relief organization. So that's what I do full time, and then evenings and weekends I head World Federation Aid, which is also an NGO. So that takes up a lot of my time. Does anyone here know what a humanitarian aid worker is, or an NGO? I mean, does anyone? I just thought I'd put it out there and see whether anyone actually knows what an NGO is or what a humanitarian aid worker does. Anyone know? Yeah. What does an NGO do? Or Relief and Development NGO, what do they do? Anyone know? Yeah, no, normally when I say I'm a humanitarian aid worker, no one actually knows what it means. So what it basically means is that as a relief and development organization, we are non-for-profit, and we work on both emergency disasters, so that is whether it's man-made conflicts or natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, landslides, the war in Syria, the war in Iraq, etc. And we try and help people that have been affected, so civilians that have been affected by such disasters. On the other side of it, we work to help people out of cyclical poverty, which means long-term development programs such as education, helping people with their livelihoods, basically trying to lift people out of poverty. Now, the way in which Miqdad asked me to speak about how I got into this line of work and sort of what my interests were and how I got into it. It's something that I've always been interested in terms of helping people, and when I watch the news and I see, for example, the Rohingya coming over from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and I've always felt really helpless, and I thought, how can I help these people? My family are a family of bankers, so either I could have done two things. I could have gone into banking, made loads of money and given lots of money to charity, or I could have done what I'm doing now and be more hands-on and grassroots. So I chose this route because I always like to be more hands-on in that way. I studied international politics, and then I did my master's in international development, which is basically the study of why the world is the way it is, why colonialism and imperialism and sort of natural resources and how they're used, and the way in which why the world is divided into what we used to call the global south, which is the sort of developing world, as people like to have called it in the past, and why how for example Britain is one of the sixth richest country in the world, and why countries in Africa are still scraping by their teeth, even though they've got so many natural resources and talent. And then I sort of went on to do some unpaid internships in various charities and organizations and NGOs. I am where I am now. Now, in terms of what Muslim Aid does, and what I've only been working at Muslim Aid for the last 9 months, and it's the only organization. It's the organization that I've had the most opportunity to sort of travel and be more hands-on with. So I thought what I'd do is share some photos of the travels that I've had in the last 9 months, and try and give you more of a human touch to the sort of work that we do. So I'm just going to turn my chair a little bit so I can see what I'm showing you. This is a picture from Mosul in Iraq, which when I went in July last year, it had just recently been liberated from ISIS 2 days before I reached there. So this is a picture of a school. I took all of these pictures that I'm going to show you, by the way. So this is a picture of a school, as you can see, completely obliterated. There were actually, and I've just got to warn you, it's a little bit harrowing, some of the things I'm going to say and show you, so I don't know whether sort of discretion is advised. But yeah, there were still bodies under the rubble. There were little signs of, school children and the sort of what it used to be before it got destroyed, backpacks and little girls' shoes and toys and that kind of thing. And the reason why I think it's important to tell you things like this is because I feel like it's really important for all of us, especially here living in the West, far away from these countries, to be aware of what's happening in our world. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us watch the news, and I'm sure a lot of us are aware, but sometimes it's difficult to make the connect between what's happening and what we see and sort of get on with our everyday lives. And I really want you all to kind of get a taste and touch of what it is that I see when I'm on these travels. So this is, as I said, a school in Mosul, and I just want you to see, if you've got children, just imagine if this was their school, how harrowing that would be for you. And there's these people I met that used to go to this school or schools like this, and it was really quite harrowing. I think I've got this wrong. Muslim Aid worked quite closely with ECHO, which is another humanitarian organization, to evacuate people from the front lines of where ISIS was still operating. So this is some of our team members evacuating some people from the front line. Again, this is me in the school, and if you look quite closely on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a little giraffe, which is a little teddy bear, which really struck with me again. It's something similar to what my nephew has here, just lives next door actually. And it just really struck me that these were running children here, children that were actually studying here, playing here, working here. And this is a home that was destroyed, and all of Mosul was like this, completely obliterated. There were still, I peered inside this house, which was completely obliterated, and there were still signs of what used to once be there, which was, I could just imagine, grandmothers and mothers and children sort of having their dinner around the table and that kind of thing. This is a photo of Hammam al-Alil camp, which is just south of Mosul, in which there were 8,000 families that had been displaced internally from Mosul. And by the way, when this picture was taken, it was 51 degrees. I think actually Lady Fatima Trust and Zahra Trust were sort of in Mosul or in Iraq at the same time that I was there. It was 51 degrees centigrade, and I couldn't wait to get back into the car where there was AC, because I literally could not stand it for more than, I think, 20 minutes. And I got back in the car, and I just couldn't imagine what these people had to suffer day in, day out in these tents, where it's actually hotter inside the tent than it is outside the tent. Now, one of the things we do as humanitarians is to provide people that live in these refugee camps with water, sanitation, blankets, stoves, food, etc. So it's kind of something that can help them ease their suffering a little bit. So in that way, it's great because you're actually able to do something hands-on. But I mean, of course, it's only a little way to help their suffering in a very small way. But yeah, it really struck me just how difficult it must be to live in these situations. Again, these were some amazing little kids who you can see, who, although they're living in a situation like that, they're still smiling, they're still laughing. They, grabbed our arms and wanted us to play football with them. And what struck me most again about these children is if you look at their feet, they don't have any shoes. And as I said, it was 51 degrees, and I could literally not bear it. And these children, and I have nephews this age, and for me, it really broke my heart to see that this could have been any one of us, really. But they're still so positive, and I think one of the lessons I took from it was, regardless of your suffering, you've just got to get on with it, no matter what your personal problems are at home. I mean, I always think when I have any issues here at home, I always, think back to these situations and think, they're getting on with it regardless of the fact that they really have nothing, and so should we. Again, just some destruction I've seen, and one of the things I often get asked is, oh, isn't it dangerous, and don't you feel scared, and all of this and that. And this is an example of one of the things that was quite dangerous. If you see in the middle of that photo, there's an unexploded mortar bomb, which I almost walked into. And those jerry cans weren't there at the time, we put them there. But it was just an example of the sort of things that humanitarian aid workers have to face. Now, the thing is, I only go out there now and then, but there's people that work there on the ground every day that have to face this sort of danger. So they're the real sort of heroes that have to kind of face this danger and the issues that you could face when you're out in the ground. This always gets quite strong reactions. I mean, it's a bus lodged on the 3rd story of a building. And you can kind of just, as I said, this is a school bus, by the way. And this was what the entire city was like. And it just makes me appreciate, again, what we have here and the pure sort of destruction of this country, which is going to take a good 20, 25 years to sort of rebuild. And I asked the Iraqi army at the time, I said, how in the world did that bus manage to get up there? I mean, can anyone guess how it got up there? Yeah, the sheer force of the bomb made it fly up and lodged itself in the 2nd story of that building. Oh, I don't think I want to show that with kids around. That was a little girl who had shrapnel in her face as a result of one of the bombs that we saw. Here I am sitting in a tent in a refugee camp that I showed you, and some of the stories that I hear of the things that people went through under ISIS. And the reason why I'm telling more stories about Iraq is because it's very similar to the stories that I heard in Syria as well. Because the topic of this speech was meant to be Syria. It's, people under ISIS have gone through all kinds of unimaginable things. I mean, every sort of barbaric act you could possibly think of, these people have undergone them. And the thing is, you hear about it on the news, but when you actually speak to someone face to face that has been whipped or beaten or raped or, and all kinds of acts of barbarism, it really brings it home that this entity called ISIS is real, and it's actually there, and it's affecting millions of lives around the world. This man really, again, struck home with me, because the issue I have when I go out to these countries is to think, oh, what if this was my father? What if this was my nephew? What if this was my mother? This man, he was barricaded in his home by ISIS, and they wouldn't let him out to get medical care. And his family carried him out of his house and to the refugee camps, and it took them 20 days. And the things he told us about the way they used to be treated was really, really upsetting, actually. These children as well, you can see the biscuits, the high-energy biscuits and the water that we gave them when we found them, had been left alone for over 48 hours in this place that we'd found them, because their mother had died in a bomb. They'd witnessed it. What's great is there's always good stories at the end of when we find people alive, and I know it's very morbid, at least they're alive and you're able to do something to help. Now, these 3 children, they lost their parents, but we were able to match them and find their aunt and help reunite them with their aunt. So in that way, it's good. But you can see sort of the trauma in the back of the two children, and it's a whole generation lost to war, and it's humanitarian organizations and eventually in the future governments that will be able to sort of help with psychosocial trauma, to help these children with their childhood and bring them back into reality as well. Shortly after I visited Mosul in July, I was in southeast Bangladesh, which is where this photo is from, receiving Rohingya people from the Myanmar border. And I think one of the things that was most striking for me was just the sheer number of people that were coming from Myanmar to Bangladesh. I mean, as you can see, this was us when we were driving down the road, and all of these people are Rohingyans, all of them. And they were just camped out on the side of the road, waiting for aid to be passed to them. And here there's less of them, but for me it was the sheer number of women and children that were coming over. And later on, I'm not sure I've got it in my slides, but I actually went right up to the border of Myanmar from Bangladesh, and I could see the smoke. I should have put that in the slide actually, but I could see the smoke from the burning villages. I mean, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of what's happening, but Muslims and not just Muslims, a people called Rohingya people, who are made up of Muslims and Christians and people of no faith, are being persecuted in Myanmar just because of their race. And they're fleeing Myanmar and coming over to Bangladesh, and they're being persecuted in Myanmar. And they come over burnt and bruised and malnourished, and again, stories of such persecution and desperation. But as a humanitarian, because you're able to do something to help relieve their pain, it kind of helps in dealing with the emotional kind of trauma of it. This was a lady who, her daughter's name was Aisha, her daughter's name is Aisha. She took 20 days to walk from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And when I met her, this baby was 14 days old, which means she gave birth on the way. And between Myanmar and Bangladesh, the only things you have are rice paddy fields. So she gave birth in a rice paddy field. And for all the mothers out there, I just really would like you to see if you can resonate between the care you would have gotten here or in Canada or America or wherever it is that you might have given birth, or your sisters or whatever might have given birth, and sort of see the difference. And obviously when she had arrived, she had still not seen a doctor by the time when I took this picture. Her baby had not had any kind of medical care or medical attention. You can see on the baby's face it was very lethargic and very malnourished. She was only, by the way, about 40 years old, but on her face she looked so much older, and you can just imagine the kind of pain and trauma they would have gone through. Again, a very elderly lady that was shot while she was trying to escape persecution. There were so many newborn babies. It was ridiculous. Again, here this picture always strikes me because these children are having to. The refugee camps are at the back. These children are having to bathe and defecate and play all in the same place, and the disease and the mess that spreads is really quite harrowing. And these last two pictures again from Syria. And for those of you that have been, I know that there are some people in the crowd that I went to Syria with, and these pictures are from right behind, say, the Zainab's shrine. So the whole area surrounding it is quite destroyed. I'm really sorry to have painted such a depressing picture of the world and sort of bring your moods down to where they probably are now. But I feel like it's very important to communicate to everyone that, although we are very, very blessed to have such luxury in our lives, we need to always, I always try and think as much as I can of, what's happening in the world and the people that are less fortunate. And we should and can always, as much as we can, give to charities, like Muslim Aid, like World Federation, etc., and the many others that are out there. But there are ways of helping hands-on too, if you want to, that you can volunteer, or you can this line of work is always a great way to help raise awareness. There's so many ways of doing it, but I mean, I wonder. I hope that sort of gives you an overview of what it is I do, as I've been asked to sort of speak about. I don't know if anyone's got any questions or anything that you want to comment on.
Thank you very much. Working? It's amazing, actually, the experience you've been through is. Thank you very much to give us really a picture of 3 continents, 3 places. Just my queries is, it seems the catastrophe is gigantic. Do you think the aid provided, is it a drop in the ocean, or is it really has effect?
Which country are you talking about?
Say, for instance, Syria or Iraq.
Okay, so if we look at Iraq.
Yes, I mean...
Civil society, I think, is one of the biggest sort of engines to help Iraq rebuild. And actually, it's funny you asked, because just 2 weeks ago there was a conference in Kuwait about the rehabilitation and reconstruction of Iraq, which I attended, where a whole bunch of governments and organizations pledged millions and millions of pounds to help build Iraq. And there's actually a conference next month that I'm helping to organize, where I've brought together aid agencies and governments and all sorts of various stakeholders to talk about how we can go forward in the rehabilitation and rebuilding of Iraq. Because although governments can do a great amount, it is civil. So when I say civil society, I mean organizations like aid agencies. They are sort of the very grassroots crux of trying to rebuild these countries a lot of the times, because they have the expertise to do so.
Yeah, but there are many aid agencies.
Yeah, there are.
What I'm talking about, your organization is
yeah, I mean that is a drop in the ocean, because obviously the need is colossal. And I think that, for example, as head of World Federation Aid, I have a certain amount of money, let's say £10,000 to give toward, Rohingya, let's say. Yeah. And the need is great: education, clothes, shelter, food, water, toys for kids. Where do I spend the money? And every day it's a battle to figure out where you need to spend the money.
How many are you in that?
In Muslim Aid, where I work full time, there are about 100 of us in the London office, which is the headquarters.
The one in the team, we go to say in Syria or Iraq. It's the team there.
So we have regional offices. So in Iraq, we had 200 people across Iraq in Muslim Aid. It depends on which country you're talking about. So in some countries we don't have any, and we work with other local NGOs and organizations. In some countries we have our own offices and we have staff that we hire there. So it depends on which country. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions?
Sorry, I was just looking. Thank you very much for your speech and sharing your experiences, which you seem to have amassed a wealth of through the different countries. I was just looking there at the picture of the Myanmar refugees, and immediately I was struck by the fact that, fecal oral disease, you've got these malnourished children, you see you've got plastic bottles of water that you're giving them, then there's going to be waste associated with that. It looks like a logistic nightmare, actually identifying the needs of the population and how many people are still influxing. They were still walking there. More and more and more people are piling up, and not only are they piling up, they're giving birth in the interim as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It looks like a massive challenge. How do you identify what the needs are, and how do you meet them?
When I got there early September, that was when the influx had just started. By that time, I think there was around 400,000 people that crossed the border from August 25th till when I arrived. There's an organisation called IOM, Institute of Migration. It's a UN body, which basically is normally tasked with coordinating all the aid efforts when you have an emergency like this. Now, when I arrived, they weren't really doing anything, and all the agencies were getting frustrated because, in the country that you're in, it depends which country you're in to be able to actually do aid efforts. You can't just rock up and start giving out aid. You have to have permission from the government. You have to, with Bangladesh, you have to submit something called an FD7, and you have to wait for the application to go through, and blah 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 blah, and then you have to then you can give out the aid, unless they reject your application, in which case you can't. So in terms of identifying needs, you have to do a needs assessment. You have to go out and you have to actually, identify an area, make sure no one else is working there, or if they are, work with them, make sure you're not duplicating efforts. There's a whole process. There's a whole needs assessment form that you fill out depending on your organisation, and it's an entire project from beginning to end. You do a needs assessment, then you see where you want what you want to tackle and which demographics, whether it's children or men or women or both or everyone. And then see whether, again, depending on the expertise of your organisation, whether you want to, for example, again, that's an emergency situation. So do you want to help with water and sanitation immediately, or food security, or shelter, or hygiene kits, or immediate education, or what it is that you want to do? And that depends on your organisation and the expertise that you hold. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. It just mind boggles. It's so multifaceted.
Yeah,
it's just not an issue of money. You can have an unlimited amount of money, but if you're not sort of targeting your efforts and getting the right people involved, it just
no, that's exactly it. Yeah. But it's, the great thing is there are lots, even the host communities. So by that I mean the people from Bangladesh themselves were coming in troves with trucks of food and clothes, and that's actually a bit more detrimental to the situation than aid agencies, because aid agencies know how to actually give out the aid. There's an entire system that you have to follow, whereas when people that are in such desperation see trucks of food, they sort of all just pile on these trucks, and then people get trampled, and it's actually quite a disaster. So it's almost like if you don't know what you're doing, you should try not to do it. That sort of situation. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. The question is, what work is being done to prevent the generation of children within Syria and Iraq at the moment from becoming a wasted sort of generation, with their talents being wasted? Because obviously the infrastructure for them to be educated is now gone, but also their mentality will be, if this takes another 25 to 30 years to rebuild, then what is the point of us trying? So what is being done really to prevent that?
Well, that's an excellent question, actually. And a lot of these children have not been in school for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, since the war started. Now that there's some stability in Syria, and obviously I say that it's quite a relative term, aid agencies are starting to look to provide education. So it's nice that you asked, because, well, as during my role at World Federation, and I just visited Syria last week, we actually just are in the process of negotiating land to build a school, which I'm sure you'll hear about soon, inshallah. But aid agencies are starting to work towards building, and I think one of the most identified needs is education, because, as I said, these children have been out of education for years now. But the thing is, education can be as easy as, propping up a tent, having one teacher and 5 children sort of sitting around you and teaching. And that's what, in fact, Muslim Aid have been doing in Myanmar with temporary schools, because we're one of the few Muslim registered NGOs in Myanmar. It's quite easy to be able to teach and educate, but it's about having the infrastructure and doing it on a wide scale. So as soon as there's stability to a country, you can roll that out quite easily. Hopefully.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for your talk today. Quick question on the politics of all of this. So you're going to people go to Syria, and the political situation is less than ideal. Going to Myanmar and Bangladesh, even Bangladesh with with Hasina, etc.
Yeah.
There are problems politically in all of these situations. How do you best not get involved in that politics when at the same time the politics are basically the driver of everything?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I was asking myself the same question a few weeks ago. Now, as a unapologetic Shia, I guess it's in my aqidah, it's in my blood, it's in my veins to always stand up against injustice and oppression. At the same time, it's also in my blood and my veins to be a humanitarian, and one of the sort of code of conduct of being humanitarian is to be impartial and neutral. So the way in which I sort of tackle that internal battle every day, so for example in Syria or wherever else, is to make sure that whoever I'm helping, and it always is whoever I'm helping, they're civilian, they don't have a part to play, and they're innocent victims of war or terror. And that is the way in which I personally handle it. In terms of as an NGO or an organization, again, it's the same principle. It's about making sure that it's civilians and those that are not involved in the active politics of it that we help. So that's the way I tackle it personally.
So just following up on that, do you ever feel, is there a requirement, even in your personal capacity, therefore, to have to abide by the impartiality on these things, in particular on issues where there's, mass killings, etc.? Is it the situation that an aid agency cannot, for example, talk about the challenges of what's happening in Myanmar and be clear as to the fact that the UN is calling it genocide? Like, can you participate in that discussion, or is the point that you can't? Where does that line draw?
You see, it'll. So, for example, if I use the example of Myanmar, if I'm operating in Myanmar to help those that are being persecuted and killed or whatever, and if I have to. If I call out against the government or whoever is doing that persecution, I'll be shut down. So for an NGO, it's always the sort of way up between whether they should say anything or whether they should, because we're not an advocacy, we're not lobbyists or advocates. That's sort of the role of someone else. Our role is to sort of help. So we can decide which one we want to do, but then that'll risk our work. So often, we don't do things that would put our work at risk, as much as you might want to, as much as you might need to, and feel like you should. It's at the risk of your work at the end of the day.
Even in a personal capacity, does that mean that you can't?
In a personal capacity, I try not to, because again, these things get picked up, and that's what I mean by it's an internal battle every day, because it's in my very nature to kind of sort of shout out against injustices or whatever that I see around the world, and. But then again, I'm an ambassador for the organisation I work for, and so I have to keep that in mind in case it gets picked up on networks or broadcasts or whatever. So yeah, it is a struggle. It's a good question.
What do you think of Syria? Are you optimistic about it? I mean.
So I've been on a couple of interviews on various channels, and whenever I get asked a political question, I always have to say I'm a humanitarian and I can't comment on the politics of it. But Syria is a very, very, very messy political situation. Everyone, because obviously I just came back, everyone's asked me, what do you think? Is what they're painting on the news the truth? And I mean, whoever you ask will paint the picture with whatever their own ideology is. So, if you're speaking to someone from the West, it'll be their ideology. If you're speaking to someone from the East, it'll be their ideology. If you speak to the people in Syria, it's nothing like the East or the West. Everyone's got their own story to tell. And that's what the difficulty is, I think. It is not black and white, and there's so many factions in Syria, especially now that ISIS have gone. There's loads of little factions. The Free Syrian Army have gone, and they've broken off into little factions as well, and it's just a big mess, really. It's not black and white. It's very complicated. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, Madiha. Thank you very much for your talk. Obviously, myself working for a charity, as you know, I'm interested to know, how do you find other charities work in line with yours, or NGOs generally, do you find them cooperative when they're working together on the ground? How approachable are other charities in working together in projects like this, or do you find often it is more a solo mission where Muslim Aid are just doing their thing separate from others? And is it even something which comes across, in terms of across the company, whereby there's a want or a will to work hand in hand with others, or is it, as I say, more a case of our agenda and our thinking, which is what I often find at our company?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this or not, but yeah, there is I think in the UK-based NGOs, there is some level of competition, especially amongst the Islamic ones, unfortunately. But it is, if I use the example of even World Federation and Muslim Aid, or even I think Zahra Trust and Muslim Aid, it's great because, for example, as I said, Muslim Aid is one of the only registered NGOs in Myanmar. No one else has access. So naturally, World Federation or Zahra Trust, etc., donated the money they raised for Rohingya to Muslim Aid to implement the projects that they have. So it's kind of like, when you need them, you cooperate, otherwise you do your own thing. That's what I found. But there is always underlying competition, which is sad, but there's also cooperation in organizations such as the Muslim Charity Forum and sharing of information. And I mean, at the end of the day, the end cause is to help the beneficiaries and those that need it. So I think when everyone kind of realigns themselves to that intention, it really helps, yeah.
So I'm sorry, just to add then to that, so what would you suggest, or what is your thinking on how we can, going forward, be more efficient and productive in, as you say, affecting the beneficiaries rather than it being something which is competitive or, of individual kind of agendas?
I think it's about inviting each other to the conversations that we have. So this conference next month, for example, on the rehabilitation and reconstruction of Iraq, I made sure that I'm inviting every single NGO that I can think of. We all need to be part of the discussions because we all bring our own expertise and our own sort of opinions, and it's the more the merrier sort of situation. And I think if we do again keep in mind the end goal, which is to help the beneficiaries, then we would be able to cooperate better. And I think it's just making sure that we if something good happens, we don't sort of keep it for ourselves, we share it. And I think shared learning is one of the most important things that we can do.
Sorry, then the last thing I would want to ask is then, what can we as civilians do, just our generally everyday people, other than obviously donating and being generous in that capacity? I know that not everyone can get out there on the ground themselves, but what would you suggest to people in terms of what can they do to help?
I think there's a couple of ways of helping. I mean, if you do want to go out there, there's a lot of organisations that offer volunteer programs. So again, Muslim Aid is one of them. We've got a program called Boots On, where we take deployments of volunteers to go and help deliver aid, and you can see the plight of the people themselves. I think raising awareness is huge. I think just by everyone's got access to social media these days, share, like, whatever you want to call it, raise awareness of what NGOs and organisations that are helping on the ground are doing. And I think it's time that we all kind of get out of our own bubble and encourage everyone that we know to sort of understand what's going on in the world and actually take an active interest in what's happening. Because one of the things I've got to say about Syria is as soon as the war started, or a few years after the war started, and there was a huge refugee crisis, I went to Lesvos, which is in Greece, where the Syrian refugees were coming to, and through Turkey and various other routes. And they're such resilient people. But what struck me most, and again, I also lived in Sweden for 2 years, where a lot of my colleagues in my Swedish classes were Syrian refugees. What struck me most about the Syrian people were that they were people just like you and I. They were wealthy or middle class, educated, engineers, doctors, lawyers, literally people just like you and me, and their life got turned upside down within days. And that's why I think it's so important for all of us to take an active interest in what's going on, because it really could be any one of us, and who knows one day what could happen. And I just feel like if we take an interest in other people and what's happening to them, then maybe one day, if God forbid, it happens to us, they'll take an interest to us. And I just think, as humanity, we are one, and we can't just live in our bubble of luxury and heat and warmth and, you know, pretend like it doesn't happen around the world.
Any final questions? Okay, I think we'll end there. Thank you very much, Madiha.
Thank you very much.
Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala.